A sitting president just threatened to bomb a country that has spent 6 months trying to help end this war. Not Iran, not an enemy, an ally, Oman. And if you think that sentence sounds like an exaggeration, it isn't. It happened yesterday, on the record. And it happened for a very specific reason that most headlines are skipping past. Because the real story here isn't really about Oman at all. It's about what the United States is afraid Iran is about to get away with, and why one small Gulf sultanate suddenly found itself in the crosshairs of the most powerful military on earth. Let's go through exactly what happened, why it happened now, and what it actually tells us about where this war is heading. Because the timing of this threat is not a coincidence. It landed on the single most important date this conflict has produced in months. Before we get into the details, if you've been tracking this war closely, you already know how fast this story moves. New developments are dropping almost every single day right now, so if you want the next update the moment it's verified, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. And I want to know something from you as we go through this. Do you think this threat is a real warning, or is it just Trump talking the way Trump talks? Drop your answer in the comments, because by the end of this video, you might change your mind either way. So here's what actually happened. On Monday, August 17th, President Trump was asked directly about ongoing negotiations between Iran and Oman over how to manage traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. According to a Fox News interview with correspondent Trey Yingst, Trump didn't hedge. He didn't give a diplomatic non-answer. He said plainly that if Oman gets in the way, the United States would bomb the country. Multiple outlets, including the Washington Post, NBC News, CNN, and Euronews, all confirmed the same core quote. Later that same day, speaking to reporters in the Oval Office, Trump was asked to expand on the comment, and rather than walking it back, he doubled down, saying he didn't think Oman had behaved very well, but that the U.S. would handle them very easily, just like we do other things. That is not the language of an offhand joke. That's the language of a president publicly signaling that an ally is now, at least rhetorically, on the target list. Here's the part that makes this so strange if you step back for a second. Oman is not Iran. Oman is not Russia. Oman is not a country the United States has ever been at war with. It's a long-standing American partner in the Gulf, a country that has quietly hosted back-channel diplomacy between Washington and Tehran for years, going back long before this current war even started. Oman has positioned itself as the one country in the region that both sides trust enough to talk through. So why would an American president threaten to bomb the one neutral party that's been trying to help broker peace? To understand that, you have to understand exactly what Oman was doing when Trump made that threat, and why it terrified Washington enough to provoke that kind of reaction. For weeks now, Iran and Oman have been negotiating directly over how to manage shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that both countries border, and that roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and gas supply passes through under normal conditions. Since the war began on February 28th, Iran has kept that strait effectively closed to normal commercial traffic. According to Al Jazeera's reporting from earlier this month, Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi said negotiations with Oman were in what he called their final stages, describing a new maritime route through Hormuz that would exist separately from the traditional shipping corridors that were used before the war. And according to a detailed CNN report from August 8th, the emerging framework involved a temporary arrangement: inbound traffic passing through a northern lane inside Iranian territorial waters, and outbound traffic moving through a southern lane inside Omani waters, coordinated jointly between Tehran and Muscat. Now here's where it gets genuinely alarming from Washington's perspective. According to NPR's reporting on the terms Iran itself disclosed, the agreement Iran described would specifically prohibit American and Israeli vessels from passing through the strait at all. Iran also said the deal would allow fines of up to 20% of cargo value for violators, and that any country or individual found to have caused damage to Iran during this war could be denied passage through both the strait and the wider Persian Gulf until Iran received compensation for war damages. Read that again slowly, because this is the actual center of the entire story. Iran wasn't just negotiating a technical shipping lane with Oman. It was describing an arrangement that would let it legally exclude the United States and Israel from one of the most important waterways on the planet, using Oman as the neutral broker to make that exclusion look like a routine maritime safety agreement rather than a wartime blockade. That is precisely why this threat landed when it did. Monday, August 17th wasn't a random day for Trump to lash out. It was the exact day that a 60-day memorandum of understanding between the United States and Iran, agreed to back in June, officially expired. That memorandum had given both sides a 2-month window to negotiate a broader deal, one that was supposed to cover reopening the strait, constraining Iran's nuclear program, and eventually ending the war. According to CNN's live coverage from that day, the deadline closed with no concrete plan announced for ending the conflict. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman said on the same day that talks with Oman were, in his words, complex but continuing. In other words, the diplomatic clock the US and Iran had set for themselves ran out, and instead of a breakthrough, what emerged instead was a separate Iran-Oman track that looked, from Washington's point of view, like Iran quietly building its own alternative to the deal that had just collapsed. So think about the position Trump found himself in on Monday morning. His own administration's negotiating deadline with Iran had expired with nothing to show for it. And at the exact same moment, Iran appeared to be finalizing an entirely separate arrangement through a third country that would functionally let it keep the strait closed to American and Israeli ships indefinitely, dressed up as a bilateral maritime safety deal with Oman rather than a hostile blockade. From that angle, the Oman threat starts to make a lot more strategic sense, even if the delivery was undeniably reckless. Trump wasn't just venting, he was trying to blow up an emerging workaround before it could be finalized and presented to the world as a done deal. It's also worth understanding that this isn't the first time Trump has aimed this kind of rhetoric at Oman specifically. According to CNN's reporting, back in May, at a cabinet meeting, Trump had already warned that Oman would behave just like everybody else if it didn't fall in line with U.S. expectations in the region. That detail matters because it shows this wasn't a one-off outburst triggered purely by frustration on a single bad news day. It's part of a pattern of the administration treating Oman's diplomatic maneuvering with real suspicion for months, long before this specific threat became a headline. Let's talk about how Oman itself has responded, because the tone from Muscat has been almost the exact opposite of Trump's. According to Euronews, Oman's foreign ministry described the ongoing talks with Iran as positive and constructive, language you'd expect from a country trying to present itself as a calm, professional mediator, rather than a party taking sides in someone else's war. Iran's side of the messaging has been more pointed. Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Bagay, reported by Euronews, framed the entire situation by saying that the insecurity around the Strait of Hormuz had been imposed on Iran, the region, and the entire world, and that the mechanism being built with Oman was meant to protect the sovereign rights of both coastal states, while still guaranteeing safe passage for ordinary commercial vessels. Notice what that framing does. It positions Iran and Oman as two coastal nations quietly solving a problem that outside powers created, which is exactly the narrative Washington doesn't want gaining traction internationally, while it's simultaneously trying to maintain the toughest possible negotiating position over the strait. This is also a good moment to be precise about something, because it matters for understanding how contested this entire situation actually is. Iran's version of the Oman deal, the part banning U.S. and Israeli vessels and allowing steep fines, comes from Iranian state and semi-official sources, describing an agreement that, as of this recording, had not been finalized on the record by Oman itself in the same specific terms. Oman's own public statements have stuck to describing the talks as ongoing and constructive without confirming every detail Iran has put forward. That gap between what Iran says the deal includes and what Oman has publicly confirmed is exactly the kind of ambiguity that lets both a genuine diplomatic breakthrough and a dangerous escalation exist as live possibilities at the same time. Now let's talk about what's actually at stake in the Strait of Hormuz itself, because without that context, none of this threat makes sense. This waterway sits between Iran's coastline to the north and Oman's coastline to the south, at its narrowest point barely wide enough for large tankers to navigate safely in both directions. Under normal pre-war conditions, roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil and gas shipments moved through this single channel every single day. When Iran closed it following the outbreak of the war in late February, the ripple effects hit fuel prices, shipping insurance, and global trade almost immediately. According to Wikipedia's sourced summary of the ongoing Hormuz crisis, the standoff has already produced a global fuel disruption, a sustained U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, a separate American naval escort operation for commercial vessels willing to risk the transit, and even the formation of a new multinational body called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, meant to help coordinate safe passage. The same tracking page documents real physical costs already paid in this standoff. At least one tugboat sunk, more than a dozen merchant ships damaged, several abandoned outright, 2 ships captured, and multiple seafarers killed or missing during the crisis so far. This is not an abstract shipping lane dispute. It's a live maritime conflict zone that just happens to also be one of the most economically important stretches of water on the planet. That's the backdrop that makes Trump's comment about turning the Strait of Hormuz into U.S. territory so significant. According to CBS News live coverage from the same day as the Oman threat, Trump told reporters in the Oval Office that declaring the strait American territory was, in his words, a great idea, adding that the U.S. already controls it with the blockade. He went on to argue that Iran can still be a nuisance, potentially planting mines in the water, but insisted the blockade had been very effective at limiting Iran's options. Put that statement next to the Oman threat and a clearer picture starts to form. This is a president who, at the exact moment a formal deadline expired without a deal, started talking simultaneously about annexing the strait rhetorically and threatening violence against the neutral broker trying to arrange safe passage through it. Those aren't two separate stories. They're the same story, told from two different angles on the same day. Before we move on, it's worth understanding exactly why Oman occupies this unusual position in the first place, because this isn't a country that stumbled into the middle of a war by accident. For decades, Oman has deliberately built a foreign policy built almost entirely around staying neutral while everyone around it picks sides. During the original nuclear negotiations that eventually produced the 2015 Iran deal, Oman quietly hosted secret early-stage talks between American and Iranian officials long before those negotiations ever became public. That history is exactly why, when this current war broke out in February, Oman was one of the only Gulf states both Washington and Tehran were willing to let sit at the table as something closer to a genuine mediator rather than a partisan actor. Saudi Arabia has its own complicated rivalry with Iran. Qatar has hosted talks too, but has also taken direct missile fire during this war. The UAE has its own economic entanglements with both sides. Oman, by comparison, has spent years cultivating exactly the kind of studied neutrality that makes a threat against its land so differently than a threat against, say, Iran directly. When you threaten Iran, you're threatening a declared wartime adversary. When you threaten Oman, you're threatening the one door that stayed open on every side of this conflict. And that's precisely why so many regional analysts reacted to Monday's comments with more alarm than they might show toward yet another round of tough talk aimed at Tehran. Let's pause here for the part of this that deserves real attention rather than just being treated as background noise, because a president threatening military action against an active U.S. ally is not a normal diplomatic event, even in a war this chaotic. According to NBC News, Democratic Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia responded to the threat by announcing that when the Senate returns from its August recess, he intends to introduce a resolution specifically designed to bar military action against Oman. That's a real legislative response from inside Trump's own government to a threat aimed at an ally. It tells you this wasn't received in Washington as harmless bluster. It was serious enough that a sitting senator felt the need to try to legally block the possibility before it could ever become policy. There's also a domestic political layer to all of this that's easy to miss if you're only following the international angle. According to the Washington Times, this threat landed in the middle of the midterm election season, with Democrats already accusing Trump of launching what they've called a war of choice against Iran, one they say has directly driven up gas prices for ordinary Americans. The same report noted that the average U.S. price of gasoline stood at $4.06 a gallon on the day of the threat, a 36% increase since the war began back in February. So when Trump talks tough about Oman and the Strait, he's not just addressing an international audience. He's also speaking to a domestic electorate that is feeling this war's costs every single time they fill up their car, and a tough public stance plays very differently to that audience than it does to diplomats in Muscat or Tehran. Let's widen the lens for a moment, because this threat didn't happen in isolation. It landed during a week already packed with other significant Middle East developments, and understanding those helps explain the pressure Trump was operating under. According to CNN's live coverage from the same day, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, met for more than 4 hours with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a day after separately holding talks with Hamas leaders in Egypt over the latest U.S.-backed peace proposal for Gaza. An Israeli source familiar with the discussions said Kushner pressed Netanyahu to move forward with the plan and, in the source's words, not create obstacles. That same CNN report noted that Netanyahu had rejected the U.S.-backed proposal just the week before, meaning Kushner was essentially trying to rescue one Trump-brokered peace effort in Gaza on the very same day Trump was blowing up the tone of negotiations in the Gulf with a threat against Oman. That's two major diplomatic fronts moving in almost opposite directions within the same 24 hours, one leaning toward de-escalation, the other leaning hard toward confrontation. And it wasn't just Gaza and Oman. The same day's coverage noted that Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi movement claimed it had attacked a Saudi military vessel and 4 escort ships in the Red Sea using ballistic missiles, following what CNN described as a weekend of escalation in the region. So on the exact day the U.S.-Iran deadline expired and Trump threatened Oman, you also had an active new attack claim in the Red Sea and a fragile Gaza ceasefire proposal hanging by a thread in Kushner's meetings. None of these threads are separate wars. They're all pieces of the same overlapping regional crisis, and pressure building on any one front tends to spill directly into how leaders behave on the others. Now, let's talk about what's actually happening on the water right now, because the numbers here tell you just how serious this standoff already is, independent of any threat Trump makes about Oman specifically. According to NBC News, citing the maritime tracking service Marine Traffic, Shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz nearly ground to a complete halt over the weekend immediately before this threat, with only 13 ships passing through the entire waterway, including just 3 vessels on Sunday alone. To put that in perspective, this is a strait that under normal conditions handles a significant share of global oil traffic every single day. 13 ships across an entire weekend is not a slowdown, it's close to a full stop. That's the environment Trump's threat landed in, a waterway already functioning at a tiny fraction of its normal capacity, with financial markets watching every single signal for any sign of whether that number is about to go up or all the way down to zero. The market reaction tells its own story. According to CBS News live tracking from the day of the threat, U.S. stock indexes dipped modestly in early trading, with the Dow Jones down roughly 0.3%, and oil prices ticked higher, even as Trump insisted the blockade had been effective at limiting Iran's ability to operate in the strait. That's a telling contradiction. If the strategy were working as cleanly as the administration claims, you wouldn't expect oil traders to be nervously pricing in more risk on the same day. But that's exactly what happened, because global markets aren't just listening to what officials say about the blockade. They're watching whether the diplomatic track that was supposed to fully reopen the strait just collapsed, and a threat against the mediator trying to keep that track alive is not a signal that inspires confidence. If you're still with us at this point, you're clearly someone who wants the full picture instead of just the headline version of this story, and that's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. If that's you, go ahead and subscribe right now, because we are going to keep tracking every twist in this Oman-Iran-Hormuz situation as it develops, and there is a lot still unresolved that we'll be covering in the days ahead. So where does this actually leave things heading into the weeks ahead? Let's walk through the realistic paths this situation could take, because there isn't just one obvious outcome here, and understanding the range of possibilities matters more than betting everything on a single prediction. The first path is that this threat turns out to be exactly what a lot of observers suspect it is, tough talk aimed more at Trump's domestic audience and at pressuring Oman psychologically than a genuine plan for military action. Under this scenario, Oman and Iran continue finalizing their maritime arrangement quietly. Washington grumbles publicly, but doesn't actually escalate against an active U.S. ally, and the strait slowly reopens to more normal traffic over the coming weeks, as both the Iran-Oman framework and separate U.S.-Iran talks eventually align closely enough to avoid direct conflict. His path is entirely plausible, given that Oman has spent years cultivating a reputation as the region's most trusted neutral party. And actually striking that country would carry enormous diplomatic costs that would likely outweigh almost any strategic benefit. The second path is a prolonged, tense standoff where nothing dramatic happens immediately, but nothing gets resolved either. Under this scenario, the Iran-Oman agreement gets finalized on paper. Iran continues describing it as banning American and Israeli vessels. The U.S. continues rejecting that framing and continues its own blockade and escort operations in parallel. And you end up with 2 competing, overlapping sets of rules governing the same stretch of water, enforced by 2 different sides who don't recognize each other's authority. That's arguably the most dangerous version of stability, because it means the passage rules commercial shippers actually have to follow depend entirely on whose warship happens to be nearby at any given moment. The third path is the one Senator Kaine's proposed resolution is specifically trying to prevent, a scenario where rhetoric against Oman escalates into something closer to actual military pressure, whether that's direct strikes, a more aggressive posture toward Omani vessels, or economic and diplomatic pressure severe enough to functionally punish Oman for negotiating with Iran at all. If that path unfolds, it would represent an enormous shift in how this war is fought, expanding it beyond Iran and its immediate allies to directly threaten an established American partner, something that would send a chilling signal to every other regional government currently trying to walk a careful, neutral line in this conflict. There's also a fourth, quieter possibility worth naming, one that doesn't get as much attention because it doesn't involve a dramatic headline either way. It's possible that this entire episode simply gets absorbed into the noise of a war that has already produced dozens of similar flashpoints over the past 6 months, remembered mainly as one more example of Trump's unscripted style, rather than as a genuine turning point. Wars this long tend to generate their own tolerance for shocking statements. What sounds alarming in isolation on a Monday can look, in hindsight a month later, like just another data point in a pattern nobody fully resolved. That doesn't make the threat any less real in the moment it was made, but it's a reminder that not every dramatic quote from this conflict ends up mattering equally once the news cycle moves on. What should you actually watch for in the coming days? If you want to know which of these paths is winning out, watch whether Oman's foreign ministry issues any further public statements responding directly to Trump's threat, since staying quiet versus pushing back publicly would tell you a lot about how seriously Muscat is taking this. Watch whether the Iran-Oman maritime framework gets formally announced and published in detail, particularly whether the specific ban on American and Israeli vessels that Iran has described actually appears in the final language or gets softened during final negotiations. Watch shipping traffic numbers through the Strait over the next several days, since a continued near-total halt would suggest this threat only added to the paralysis, not something moving toward resolution. And watch what happens with Senator Kaine's resolution once the Senate returns from recess, because a resolution specifically designed to prevent military action against a named U.S. ally is not a routine piece of legislation, and how much support it gathers will tell you a great deal about how genuinely worried official Washington is about where this could go. It's also worth being honest about how unusual it is for a threat like this to draw an immediate legislative response rather than just criticism from the opposing party's pundits. Resolutions aimed at restraining a president's use of military force against a specific named country don't get introduced casually. They require a senator to believe there is a genuine, non-trivial chance that rhetoric could translate into an actual military order if left unchecked. That alone tells you something about how this threat was read inside Washington, even by people who aren't reflexively opposed to the administration's broader approach to Iran. Whether or not that resolution ever gets a vote, let alone passes, its mere introduction becomes part of the public record here, a marker that at least one branch of government treated an offhand-sounding threat against an ally as serious enough to require a formal check. There's one more layer worth sitting with before we wrap this up, because it's easy to get lost in the strategic chess pieces here and forget what's actually at stake underneath all of it. Every additional day the Strait stays this heavily restricted is another day of elevated fuel prices rippling outward into economies that have nothing to do with this war directly. It's another day shipping companies have to recalculate insurance risk on every vessel they route anywhere near this region. And it's another day where a miscalculation, a single vessel misidentified, a single warning shot fired by the wrong side at the wrong moment could turn a war of threats and negotiating postures into something with immediate, irreversible consequences for people far beyond Iran, Oman, or the United States. So here's the honest way to summarize where this stands right now. A 60-day U.S.-Iran deadline expired with no deal. In its place, Iran and Oman appear close to finalizing a separate arrangement that Tehran says would functionally exclude the United States and Israel from one of the most important waterways in the world. In response, an American president publicly threatened to bomb the mediator trying to broker that arrangement, doubled down on the threat hours later, and simultaneously floated the idea of declaring the Strait itself American territory. A U.S. senator is now moving to legally block military action against that same ally. Oil markets are already reacting nervously. And underneath all of it, weekend ship traffic through the Strait has nearly collapsed to a trickle. None of that is exaggerated for effect. That is simply what happened this week, laid out in order. What do you think happens from here? Does Oman quietly fold and distance itself from Iran to avoid becoming the next flashpoint in this war? Or does this threat end up backfiring, pushing Muscat and Tehran even closer together out of shared frustration with Washington's approach? Tell me your read in the comments, because on a story evolving this fast, the people watching closely often catch the next shift before it even makes headlines. And if this breakdown gives you a clearer picture of what's actually happening in the Gulf right now than the short clips floating around online, do us a favor and share it with one person who's been trying to make sense of this war. That's the single most useful thing you can do for this channel this week. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with the next verified update the moment there is one.